What makes a man legendary? For Josiah, the answer began when he was just a boy. At only 8 years old, he was crowned king over a great nation, Judah, the chosen people of God. Too young to rule, too small to carry the weight of a crown, and yet history would remember his name. By the time he was 20, he had already conquered more than armies. He had conquered the idols that chained his people. Altars were smashed, shrines were burned, and false gods crumbled before the zeal of a king who refused to bow to anything but the Lord. Josiah wasn't just a young king. He became a reformer, a restorer, a ruler whose influence stretched beyond Judah's borders, uniting what had been broken, bringing the land back under one name. But how did he do it? How could a boy rise to such greatness, and how did his reign, filled with glory, end in such sudden tragedy? This is the story of King Josiah, the boy who became king, and the man who gave a nation back to God. The palace in Jerusalem was unusually quiet on that day. Whispers filled the halls, and the people of Judah anxiously waited for the news. Their king, Amon, had been struck down by his own servants. In an instant, the throne of Judah stood empty, and the nation trembled at what might come next. But in the midst of them chaos, all eyes turned to a child. His name was Josiah, and he was only 8 years old. Imagine this for a moment. A boy still learning to write his letters, still small in stature, suddenly being handed a crown and told that he must now rule an entire kingdom. The weight of leadership pressed upon his little shoulders. While most children played in the dusty streets of Jerusalem, Josiah now sat on the grand throne of David, the legendary king who had once ruled Israel with strength and faith. The people wondered, what kind of king could this child possibly be? His father, Amon, had not walked in the ways of God. In fact, Amon had filled Judah with idols, leading the nation deeper into sin. His grandfather, Manasseh, had been even worse. For over 50 years, Manasseh had led the people into the darkest practices, building altars to false gods, worshipping the stars, even shedding innocent blood in Jerusalem. The land was stained with corruption, and the people's hearts had grown cold toward the God of their fathers. But Josiah was different. Though young, something stirred in his heart that set him apart from those before him. The Bible says, "He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and walked in the ways of his father David. He did not turn aside to the right or the left." 2 Kings 22 verse 2. Even as a child, Josiah had a softness toward God. Perhaps he had heard the old stories of Moses and the Exodus, or the songs of David that still echoed in the temple courts. Maybe faithful priests whispered truth into his young ears. Whatever the case, while the throne was surrounded by idolatry and wicked traditions, Josiah's heart leaned toward righteousness. Life in the palace would not have been easy for him. Advisors likely tried to control his decisions, and powerful men in Judah may have looked down on him because of his age. But Josiah was not like other kings. He didn't rely on his own wisdom or the traditions of his fathers. Instead, he quietly began to seek God, even while still a boy. Picture him sitting in the palace at night, looking out at the stars. Around him, people bowed to the stars and carved images. But Josiah's young heart wondered about the one true God who had made those very stars. Unlike his father Amon, Josiah did not worship created things. His heart longed for the Creator himself. By the time Josiah turned 16, his faith began to take root in action. He no longer saw himself just as a boy who wore a crown. He began to see himself as a shepherd of God's people. But those years between 8 and 16 were years of preparation. They were years when God was shaping his heart, teaching him to listen, and stirring in him a fire that would one day blaze across Judah. Children are often overlooked, but Josiah's early years remind us of something powerful. Age does not limit God's calling. Though he was small, though he had no battle experience, and though his kingdom was filled with older men who thought they knew better, Josiah carried something they did not, a heart that loved the Lord. And so the first chapter of Josiah's life begins not with mighty battles or grand reforms, but with a child choosing to walk a different path than his father and grandfather. While those before him chased idols, Josiah chose the way of David. While others polluted the land with false worship, Josiah kept his heart clean before God. The people of Judah may not have realized it yet, But change was coming. God was raising a boy king who would one day shake the nation to its core. And though he wore the crown of a king, Josiah would first be remembered as a boy whose heart beat for God. 8 years had passed since Josiah first wore the crown. He was no longer the small boy people whispered about in the palace halls. Now, at 16 years old, Josiah was growing into manhood, and something deeper began to stir inside him. The throne was still his, the weight of leadership still heavy, but his heart leaned more than ever toward the God of Israel. The land around him was filled with idols. On every hilltop, shrines to false gods stood tall. In the valleys, incense was burned to Baal and Asherah. Wooden images, carved with care but powerless, dotted the streets. Many in Judah had grown so used to this corruption that they no longer saw it as evil. It was simply life as they knew it. But Josiah's heart was different. Unlike his father Amon or his grandfather Manasseh, Josiah longed to know the God of his ancestor David, the God who had rescued Israel from Egypt, who had split the Red Sea, and who had given the law at Sinai. In the quiet moments of his reign, Josiah sought this God. The scriptures describe this turning point simply. In the 8th year of his reign, while he was still young, he began to seek the God of his father David. Seeking God became more than curiosity. It grew into determination. Josiah began to notice the idols with new eyes, and what he saw broke his heart. How could his people bow to wood and stone? How could they offer sacrifices to gods that could not hear them, while ignoring the living God who had given them life? By the time Josiah reached 20 years of age, he could no longer remain silent. His seeking had turned into conviction, and conviction demanded action. He rose from his throne with a fire in his spirit, ready to cleanse Judah of its wickedness. The reforms began in Jerusalem, the very heart of the kingdom. The altars of Baal were torn down. The carved images were smashed into dust. The Asherah poles, tall wooden symbols of false worship, were cut down and burned. Priests who had led the people astray were removed from their places of influence. The young king spared nothing. He would not tolerate compromise, for his nation belonged to the Lord. But Josiah's zeal did not stop in Jerusalem. He traveled through the towns of Judah, tearing down shrines and scattering idols. The smoke of burning false gods rose into the air as Josiah purified city after city. Even in the ruined land of the northern kingdom of Israel, Josiah's reforms reached. Where other kings had left corruption standing, Josiah tore it apart. Picture him on horseback, riding through the countryside, his eyes blazing with determination. Soldiers and workers followed behind, carrying axes, hammers, and fire. Wherever they went, the high places came crashing down. The people watched in awe as their young king destroyed what had stood for generations. Some resisted, clinging to their idols. But many more were stirred, realizing for the first time that perhaps the God of their fathers still called to them. Josiah's reforms were not a single act but a long campaign. He sought not only to destroy what was false but to restore what was true. The temple, long neglected, began to be repaired. Worship, once polluted with idols, began to be purified. Slowly but surely, the land was being cleansed, not only of stone and wood, but of the spiritual poison that had seeped into Judah's heart. At just 20 years old, Josiah displayed a courage few kings before him had shown. Other rulers had turned blind eyes to idolatry. Some had even encouraged it. But Josiah was determined to bring Judah back to God, no matter the cost. His youth did not hold him back. It only fueled his passion. He was still young, but his strength was devoted to God. His hands that once played as a boy now pulled down altars. His voice that once trembled now commanded boldly in the name of the Lord. This was not a quiet reform hidden in secret. It was loud, visible, and unmistakable. By the time Josiah's campaign spread across the land, Judah looked very different. The idols were broken, the altars were gone, and the people could no longer ignore the power of their king's conviction. Though opposition surely lingered in hearts, Josiah pressed on. For him there was no turning back. The God he sought in his youth had filled him with resolve. Every altar smashed, every idol burned was a declaration. Judah belonged not to Baal, not to Asherah, not to the stars in the sky, but to the Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Josiah had begun his reign as a boy king, fragile and uncertain. But by his 20th year, he had become a man whose heart burned with purpose. His story was only just beginning, but already it was clear. Josiah would not walk in the footsteps of his father. He would not repeat the sins of his grandfather. Instead, he would carve a new path, a path that led back to God. The years of cleansing had left Judah transformed. The land that once bowed to Baal now bore the marks of Josiah's reforms. The idols were shattered, the high places torn down, the Asherah poles burned to ash. But Josiah knew his work was not finished. It was one thing to remove corruption. It was another to restore the heart of true worship. By the time Josiah reached the age of 26, his zeal for God had only deepened. He turned his attention to the very center of Judah's faith, the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem. Once the pride of Solomon, the temple had fallen into disrepair. Its stones were cracked, its walls darkened, and its holy courts neglected. For years, money that had been set aside for its care was misused, and the house of God had been treated with dishonor. Josiah commanded that the temple be repaired. He sent Shaphan the secretary, Messiah the governor, and Joah the recorder to oversee the work. Faithful men were chosen to gather silver from the priests and distribute it to skilled workers, carpenters, builders, and masons, who would restore the house of the Lord to its beauty. The sound of hammers echoed once more in Jerusalem. Stone was cut, beams were raised, walls were patched, and the temple began to take shape again. It was in the midst of this restoration that something unexpected happened, something that would change Josiah's life forever. Deep within the temple, as dust was swept away and chambers were cleared, the high priest Hilkiah stumbled upon a scroll. At first glance, it looked ordinary, a forgotten piece of parchment lying in the shadows. But as Hilkiah unrolled it, his eyes widened. He had discovered the book of the law of the Lord given through Moses. This was no ordinary scroll. It contained the very words of God, commandments, statutes, and promises written generations earlier. For years, it had been hidden, buried under neglect, while Judah chased after idols. Now, in Josiah's reign, it had been found. Hilkiah hurried to Shaphan, the king's secretary, and placed the scroll in his hands. "I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord," he said. With trembling hands, Shaphan unrolled it and began to read. The words burned with power. They were not the words of men. They were the words of the living God. Soon after, Shaphan was brought before Josiah. Along with a report of the repairs and the money gathered, he carried the scroll. In the quiet of the palace, he opened the parchment and began to read aloud to the king. As Josiah listened, the words struck his heart like arrows. He heard the commands of the Lord, the warnings against idolatry, and the covenant blessings and curses given to Israel. He realized with horror how far Judah had strayed from God's commands. The nation had not merely wandered, they had rebelled. They had broken the covenant, ignored God's laws, and filled the land with sin. Josiah's face grew pale, and his body trembled. Overwhelmed by sorrow, he tore his royal robes in grief. This was no small gesture. For a king, to tear his garments was a sign of deep anguish, a cry of repentance, a recognition that he stood guilty before the Holy One. Judah was in danger. The words of the scroll made it clear God's wrath would fall upon those who abandoned him. Josiah saw it now. His people had invited judgment upon themselves. Though he had torn down idols and purified the land, it was not enough. The nation's guilt was heavy, and Josiah feared what God might do. Desperate for understanding, Josiah turned to his officials. "Go," he commanded. "Inquire of the Lord for me, for the people, and for all Judah concerning the words of this book that has been found. For great is the wrath of the Lord that is poured out on us, because our fathers have not kept the word of the Lord, to do according to all that is written in this book." So Hilkiah the priest, Shaphan the secretary, and others went to the prophetess Huldah, who lived in Jerusalem. When they shared the discovery and Josiah's grief, she gave a solemn prophecy. "Thus says the Lord," she declared, I will indeed bring disaster upon this place and upon its inhabitant, all the curses that are written in the book that has been read before the king of Judah, because they have forsaken me and burned incense to other gods. My wrath will be poured out on this place, and it will not be quenched. But then her tone softened, and she spoke directly of Josiah. Because your heart was tender, and you humbled yourself before God when you heard his words, tearing your clothes and weeping before me, I have heard you. You will not see the disaster I will bring on this place and its people. You will be gathered to your grave in peace. When Josiah's messengers returned with these words, the young king was deeply moved. Judgment was indeed coming, but God had seen his heart. He had bowed low before the Lord, and his humility had delayed the disaster. Josiah's discovery of the scroll was more than an accident. It was God's timing, God's mercy, and God's call. The forgotten book of the law had been hidden in darkness, but in Josiah's reign, it came back to light. The king who had begun seeking God at 16 and cleansing the land at 20 now faced his greatest challenge yet. The words of the law demanded not just reform of outward idols, but a renewal of the people's covenant with God. And Josiah, with tears still fresh on his cheeks, knew what he must do. The book of the law had shaken Josiah to his core. The words of Moses, written long ago, had pierced the silence of Judah's sin and awakened the heart of a king. He could no longer rest knowing how far his nation had strayed from God. The idols had been torn down, yes, but that was only the beginning. What Judah needed now was not just cleansing, it was renewal. Josiah summoned the elders of Judah and Jerusalem. The call went out across the land, and leaders from every tribe, priests from every corner, and citizens from every street gathered in the holy city. Men, women, and children all crowded into the open courts of the temple. A great assembly filled the air with murmurs as anticipation spread through the crowd. At the center stood Josiah, no longer the boy king, but a man whose voice carried weight and whose heart burned with conviction. In his hands was the very scroll discovered in the temple. The crowd fell silent as he unrolled it, his eyes fixed on the sacred words. From beginning to end, Josiah read aloud the book of the law. His voice echoed through the temple courts, carrying words that had not been heard publicly for generations. The commands of God, the warnings against idolatry, the covenant promises, all rang out once more. Parents clutched their children's hands. Elders bowed their heads. The people listened with hearts pierced by the truth of their guilt and the greatness of their God. When the reading was finished, Josiah did not sit. He did not dismiss the crowd. Instead, he stepped forward, standing by the great pillar that marked the entrance of the temple courts. Before the eyes of all Judah, he raised his voice and declared a covenant with the Lord. With hands lifted and head bowed, Josiah pledged. He would follow the Lord and keep his commands, statutes, and decrees with all his heart and soul. He would walk in obedience to everything written in the book of the law. His words were not a ceremony. They were a vow, a binding promise that his reign would belong to God alone. Then Josiah turned to the people, and one by one, tribe by tribe, they too pledged themselves to the covenant. From the highest noble to the humblest servant, the people of Judah stood together, renewing their allegiance to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It was not merely the covenant of their ancestors. It became their own. But Josiah's reform did not stop at words. Action followed swiftly. Once more he sent men throughout the land, purging every last remnant of idolatry. Even the smallest shrine was torn down. Sorcerers, mediums, and household gods were removed from Judah. The land was swept clean, not only of the great idols that towered over cities, but of the hidden practices that lingered in homes and villages. The Passover, too, was restored. For generations, it had been neglected or observed half-heartedly. But Josiah commanded that it be celebrated as the law prescribed. The priests and Levites prepared the sacrifices, and the people gathered in Jerusalem in a feast unlike any seen since the days of the judges. The blood of lambs flowed as families remembered the night God had delivered their ancestors from Egypt. Songs of praise rose into the air, and joy filled the city as Judah once more tasted the sweetness of obedience. The scriptures record that such a Passover had not been observed in centuries. Not in the days of the kings of Israel, not even in the days of Samuel. It was a celebration of faith renewed, a nation restored, a people once again bound to the Lord their God. Through it all, Josiah's hand guided the nation. He was relentless in his devotion. Where other kings had faltered, Josiah pressed on. Where others had compromised, Josiah stood firm. The covenant he made was not a fleeting vow. It became the anchor of his reign. And yet, as the people rejoiced and the land was purified, a shadow lingered. For though Josiah's reforms were great, and his covenant sincere, the words of the prophetess Huldah remained. Judgment would still come, for the sins of generations had not been forgotten. The wrath of the Lord would not be quenched forever. But in Josiah's time mercy reigned. His humility had delayed the disaster, and his covenant had restored worship to the land. For as long as Josiah lived, Judah would walk in the light of a king who sought the Lord with all his heart and soul. The story of Josiah's covenant was more than an event. It was a moment in history when a nation was called back to the heart of their God.